She was a temporary solution.
She was a bargain, Mother. A good one. It was a transaction, and it was never meant to be anything else.
Eleanor Ashworth had spent 11 months learning the architecture of Calloway Manor, its corridors and their particular echoes, the hour each morning when the light reached the library's bay window, the precise creak of the third stair that no amount of oil ever quite silenced. What she had not yet learned, on the grey afternoon this story properly begins, was that one of the house's many silences was about to break, and that when it did, an open door would matter more than anything her husband had ever said to her directly. The marriage, by anyone's accounting, had begun as an arrangement. Gideon Ashworth, 6th Duke of Calloway, had inherited a title, a manor with a roof that leaked in 4 places, and debts that had accumulated across 2 generations of men who preferred horses and cards to ledgers. Eleanor Whitmore had inherited something rarer in the circles that mattered to the Ashworths, a fortune, built by her late father's shipping interests, and a face that turned heads from London to Bath without her ever having to try. When the match was first proposed, the drawing rooms of Mayfair had not bothered with subtlety. They had said it plainly, behind fans and over teacups, that the Duke of Calloway had married trade money to save his roof, and that the girl from the shipping family had purchased herself a coronet to go with it. Eleanor had heard every version of this. She had smiled through each one, because smiling cost her nothing and arguing would have cost her everything. What she had not expected, what nobody, least of all Eleanor, had thought to warn her about, was Gideon himself. He was not the cold, transactional figure the gossip columns preferred. In the privacy of Calloway Manor, he was attentive in small, deliberate ways that accumulated, over 11 months, into something Eleanor found she had no ready word for. He remembered that she took her tea without sugar, though he never remarked on it. He took the longer path through the gardens because she preferred the roses to the clipped hedges, and never once mentioned that he'd noticed her preference at all. He sat with her by the library fire some evenings long after the rest of the household had gone to bed, reading in companionable silence, occasionally glancing up to find her already watching him, and looking away again before either of them had to decide what that meant. 11 months in, Eleanor had begun, cautiously, to wonder whether the bargain had been a considerably kinder fate than she'd dared to hope for. That afternoon, the grey one, the one this story turns on, they sat together in the smaller of the 2 drawing rooms while a soft, persistent rain ticked against the windows. A letter had arrived that morning, and Eleanor had watched the color leave Gideon's face as he read it, watched him fold it with unnecessary care and set it aside without a word. She had not asked. She rarely asked, directly, about anything. She had learned, in 11 months, that Gideon told her things in his own time, and that pressing him only made the telling take longer. "You've been somewhere else all day," she said instead, setting down her embroidery. Gideon reached for her hand rather than answering at once, his thumb tracing slow, absent circles over her knuckles, a habit she had stopped pretending not to enjoy months ago. "My mother is coming to stay," he said. "A fortnight. Possibly longer." Eleanor's stomach dropped, quietly, the way a stone drops into deep water, no splash, just the long disappearance. She had met the Dowager Duchess exactly twice. Once at the wedding, where Constance's congratulations had lasted roughly the length of a single breath. Once at a dinner where Eleanor had been seated, with what she suspected was considerable deliberation, at the far end of a very long table. "She doesn't approve of me." It was not a question, and Eleanor did not pretend it was one. "She doesn't approve of anything that wasn't her idea first." The corner of Gideon's mouth lifted, a small, deliberate attempt, Eleanor realized, to coax a smile out of her. "Whatever she says while she's here, whatever she implies, it changes nothing. You belong at Calloway, Eleanor. That was true the day we married. It is true now. It will be true in 20 years, regardless of anything my mother decides to say about it in the meantime." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips briefly to her knuckles, and for a moment the rain and the letter and the looming fortnight all receded to somewhere very far away. "Promise me something," he added, quieter now, the particular quiet she had learned, slowly, to recognize as the version of him that meant things most. "Whatever my mother says while she's here, don't let it touch you. Let her think what she likes. None of it is true. Eleanor nodded, and let herself believe him completely, because she had no reason yet not to. She had no way of knowing that within 3 days, she would hear her husband say 4 words that would unmake everything she thought she understood about her marriage, and that the library, the one room at Callaway Manor she had quietly come to think of as hers, would be the very place where it happened. The Dowager Duchess of Callaway arrived on a Thursday, in a traveling carriage so dark and severe it might have been mistaken, at a distance, for a hearse, and within the hour, Eleanor understood that the coming fortnight would test every reserve of composure she possessed. Constance Ashworth swept into the entrance hall wrapped in a dark burgundy traveling cloak, her silver hair pinned beneath an elaborate lace traveling cap, her silver wolf-headed cane striking the marble floor with each unhurried step, a sound, Eleanor would come to realize, that Constance employed the way other people employed a raised eyebrow. She greeted her son with a brief, correct embrace, and turned to Eleanor with an expression that managed to be perfectly civil and entirely without warmth in the same instant, a feat Eleanor suspected took practice. Eleanor. The name arrived clipped, as though it cost something to produce. You look well. Marriage agrees with you, or perhaps it's simply that trade keeps gentler hours than the ton. Eleanor felt the remark land precisely where it was aimed and kept her smile in place without effort, because she had had 11 months of practice and considerably more before that. Welcome to Callaway, Your Grace. I hope the roads weren't too unkind. Unkind enough, Constance said, already turning toward the staircase, though nothing rivals the particular fatigue of watching an old name carried by new money. Gideon's jaw tightened, Eleanor felt it, more than saw it, through the hand still resting at her elbow, but he said nothing, not in front of the assembled staff. Later, in the privacy of their rooms, when Eleanor mentioned the exchange lightly, trying to make it sound smaller than it had felt, Gideon simply drew her against him and murmured that his mother's tongue had always outpaced her judgment, and that neither would alter the facts of anything. Eleanor wanted, very much, to believe this was the end of the matter. Over the following days, however, she began to notice a pattern forming with the quiet inevitability of damp finding its way through a wall. Whenever Gideon and his mother spoke privately, his expression afterward carried a tightness that took hours to fade. Whenever Eleanor entered a room the two of them occupied, the conversation did not stop abruptly, it simply tapered, the way a door closes softly when someone would prefer you hadn't heard what was on the other side of it. She told herself this was old history between mother and son. Nothing to do with her. She had no evidence yet to think otherwise. Then came the dinner with Lord and Lady Brightmoor. It was a modest gathering by Callaway's standards, 6 at table, candlelight, the usual measured conversation about the harvest, Parliament, and the unrelenting wretchedness of the winter roads. But Eleanor noticed, with the particular attentiveness of a woman who has spent a lifetime reading rooms she was not always welcome in, how often Constance steered the conversation toward the Brightmoor's daughter, Lady Helena's accomplishments at the pianoforte, Lady Helena's connections among the better families of 3 counties, the considerable estate that would one day be hers entire. Eleanor noticed, too, how Constance's pale blue eyes drifted toward Gideon each time Lady Helena's name was raised, a small, precise, measuring glance, as though Constance were checking the level of something in a glass. Gideon gave his mother nothing to measure. If anything, he grew unusually quiet for the remainder of the evening, the particular quiet Eleanor had learned to associate with him weighing something he had not yet decided how to say. That night, lying awake long after the house had gone still, Eleanor turned the dinner over and over, examining it from every angle the way she might examine a ledger that didn't balance. She thought of the letter that had arrived the morning before his mother did, the one Gideon still hadn't explained, hadn't even mentioned again. She thought of his promise, low and careful by the drawing-room fire, whatever my mother says, don't let it touch you. None of it is true. She had not yet asked herself, not really, what exactly his mother might say. The next morning, restless and unable to settle to her embroidery, Eleanor retreated to the library, the one room at Callaway Manor that had, almost without her noticing, become entirely her own. Tucked at the end of the east corridor, its shelves smelling of leather and old paper, its deep bay window catching whatever light the season allowed, it was the room where she felt least like a transaction and most like herself. She curled into the window seat with a book she had no real intention of reading, left the heavy oak door slightly ajar out of long habit. She had always preferred to hear the house moving around her rather than be sealed away from it, and let the quiet settle over her like a second shawl. She had no idea that within the hour, that same open door would carry every word of a conversation she was never meant to hear. To understand what happened in the library, it helps to understand what had been happening, quietly, in the 3 days before it. Constance Ashworth did not announce her intentions. She had never needed to. Her particular gift, the one that had governed Calloway Manor for 30 years before Eleanor ever set foot in it, was the gift of rearranging a room without appearing to move a single thing in it. On the first evening of her visit, over sherry before dinner, Constance had mentioned, lightly, as one might mention the weather, that Lord Brightmoor had recently settled a considerable sum on Lady Helena's eventual marriage portion. On the second evening, she had observed, to no one in particular, that the Brightmoor lands marched alongside Calloway's northern boundary for nearly 2 miles, and what an elegant consolidation that would make, for a family inclined toward consolidation. Gideon had said nothing to either remark. He had simply gone quieter, in the way Eleanor recognized and had not yet learned to be wary of. On the third morning, the morning Eleanor settled into the library with her unread book, Constance had asked her son, over breakfast, whether he intended to ride out to inspect the north boundary fences before the worst of the winter weather arrived. It was, on its surface, an entirely ordinary question about entirely ordinary estate business. It was also, Eleanor would later understand, an invitation, carefully worded, easily declined, and not declined. Gideon had gone with his mother on a walk after breakfast. Eleanor had not been invited, and had not expected to be. Estate business between a duke and his dowager mother was not, by any reasonable measure, something a duchess needed to attend. She had retreated to the library instead, telling herself, accurately, as far as it went, that she had letters of her own to answer and an hour to herself was no great loss. What Eleanor did not know, curled in the window seat with the rain beginning again softly against the glass, was that the walk had not stayed outdoors for long. The cold had driven mother and son back inside within 20 minutes, and Constance, with the unerring instinct of a woman who had lived in a house for 30 years and knew precisely which rooms were occupied at which hours, had steered the conversation toward the east corridor, toward the long stretch of dim hallway that ran past the library, confident in the reasonable assumption that no one would be in earshot. She was not wrong about no one being in the corridor. She was wrong about the door. Eleanor heard the footsteps before she heard the voices, the brisk, precise tap of Constance's cane on the runner carpet, familiar by now, and Gideon's longer, quieter stride beside it. She thought nothing of it. People walked past the library door a dozen times a day. She turned a page she did not read, and let the sound pass. It did not pass. It stopped. Just outside the door, just beyond the narrow strip of dim corridor visible from the window seat if Eleanor had thought to look, which she had not yet, Constance Ashworth's voice rose, just slightly, into the particular register she used for matters she considered settled in advance. "You cannot keep avoiding this conversation, Gideon," she said. "Lord Brightmoor has made his interest in an alliance entirely plain. Helena is everything this family requires, connections, land, a name that opens doors no amount of trade money ever could. It is the match Calloway should have made from the start, and you know it." Eleanor's hand, resting on the open page, went very still. She told herself, in the half-second available to her before Gideon answered, that this was simply more of what she had been hearing for 3 days, Constance's particular weather, blowing through as it always did, signifying nothing. "The match has already been made, mother," Gideon said. His voice was even. Controlled. "I am married. To a merchant's daughter." The cane struck the floor once, sharp and final. A convenient arrangement that solved a temporary problem. No one expects it to be more than that, least of all, I should hope, you. A pause stretched out, long enough that Eleanor could hear the rain, and her own pulse, and very little else. She should have risen. She should have closed the door, or made some small sound to announce her presence, or simply walked out into the corridor and let her presence end the conversation entirely. She would think, afterward, about all the things she should have done. She did none of them. She sat in the window seat with the book open and forgotten on her lap, and she listened, because some part of her, the part that had spent 11 months quietly, carefully, hopefully building a life inside this marriage, needed to hear how Gideon would answer. Helena Brightmore is willing to wait, Constance pressed on, patient, certain. An annulment, on grounds of. There will be no annulment. Gideon's voice cut across hers, harder now, but not louder, if anything, quieter, the way a door closes more firmly the harder someone tries to push it open. I won't discuss this further. Then have the honesty, at least, to admit what this marriage is, so that I might know how to manage Lord Brightmore's expectations going forward. Tell me plainly, Gideon. Do you love this girl? Or do you simply find her convenient? The silence that followed felt, to Eleanor, considerably longer than it can possibly have been. When Gideon finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something flat and exhausted, the voice, Eleanor would think later, of a man who wanted an argument to end more than he wanted anything else in that moment, and who had not yet understood the cost of the particular tool he reached for to end it. She was a bargain, Mother. A good one, her fortune saved this house, and I'm grateful for it. But don't mistake gratitude for anything deeper. It was a transaction. It was never meant to be anything else. The words arrived in the library the way stones arrive in still water, not loudly, but completely, displacing everything around them. And then, footsteps. Retreating. Unhurried. Constance's cane, tapping away down the corridor with the satisfied rhythm of a woman who has concluded a piece of business to her own satisfaction. Gideon's longer stride beside it, fading. Neither of them glanced toward the library door. Neither of them knew. Eleanor did not move. For a long moment, she found she could not. The book slid from her lap and struck the carpet with a soft, final sound that seemed, in the emptiness of the library, almost unbearably loud, and still she sat there, staring at the strip of corridor visible through the half-open door, replaying 4 words until they no longer arranged themselves into anything she recognized as English at all. A good one. A transaction. Never meant to be anything else. She thought of his hand around hers, 2 days before, by the drawing-room fire. Whatever my mother says, don't let it touch you. None of it is true. She had believed him. Completely. Without reservation. The way one believes a thing that has, until that moment, never once been contradicted by anything she had seen with her own eyes. Eleanor pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, not to weep, though the pressure behind her eyes suggested that might come later, but to hold something else in. A sound. A question. The beginning of a question she did not yet have words for, which was, roughly, which version of you is the lie? The one who held my hand by the fire, or the one who just described our marriage to his mother through a door he never thought to check? She did not have an answer. She would not have one for some time. What she had, instead, was the rest of that day, and the particular, dangerous quiet of a woman who has decided, very suddenly, to become extremely polite. If you've ever had the ground shift beneath you in the space of a single sentence, if you know exactly what it feels like to hear someone you trusted completely say the thing you were always, secretly, afraid they thought, then you already know exactly where Eleanor is right now. And honestly, this is where the story actually begins. If you want to find out what a woman like Eleanor does with 4 words she was never meant to hear, and whether she was a bargain turns out to mean what it sounds like it means, make sure you're subscribed and following along, because what happens in the next 2 days is the entire reason this story exists. For 2 days, Eleanor said nothing. She moved through Calloway Manor exactly as she always had, overseeing the household accounts, sitting through dinners under the gentle weather of Constance's remarks, even producing, when Gideon's eyes found hers across a room, the small smile that had always, until now, come easily. But something behind her own eyes had gone quiet and distant, like a window shuttered from the inside, and Gideon noticed almost at once, even without being able to name what, precisely, had changed. "You've been unusually reserved," he observed, on the second evening, watching her across the drawing room with the particular attentiveness that had once made her feel so thoroughly seen. "Is something troubling you?" "Only tired," Eleanor said, without looking up from the letter she was writing. "Your mother's visit has been, a great deal." It was not entirely a lie. The letter was addressed to her late father's solicitor in London, a quiet, careful inquiry into the precise terms of her marriage settlement, and what would become of it, exactly, should she choose to live apart from her husband. She wrote it the way she did everything when she had decided not to feel anything yet, methodically, without a single crossed-out word. Hattie noticed too. Eleanor's lady's maid had dressed her hair every morning for 6 years, and there was very little about Eleanor that escaped her, including the fact that her mistress had eaten almost nothing in 2 days, and had twice been found simply standing at her bedroom window, looking at nothing at all, for longer than standing at a window generally requires. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace." Hattie's voice was careful, on the third morning, as she fastened the clasp of Eleanor's bracelet. "But is everything quite all right? You haven't seemed yourself since," she hesitated, "since you were in the library." "The day His Grace and the Dowager had words, out in the East Corridor." Eleanor's hands went very still. "You knew the door was open." "I came to fetch you for luncheon, Your Grace." "I saw the door ajar, and His Grace and the Dowager standing just past it, and Hattie's cheeks colored, and for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, Hattie was not humming. "I thought it best not to interrupt. I didn't realize you'd heard them. Not until I saw your face after." So someone else had seen. Someone else knew. That afternoon, Eleanor reached her decision. She would not make a scene, that had never been her way, and besides, a scene would only confirm every uncharitable thing Constance Ashworth had ever believed about a duchess, from trade. Instead, she would simply leave, quietly, for a fortnight, under the entirely reasonable pretense of visiting her aunt in Bath, whose health had been delicate for months and whose letters had been hinting, gently, that a visit would be welcome. From Bath, away from Calloway Manor, away from its library, its corridors, and the man who had once made her believe she belonged in either, she could decide, properly, what came next. She gave the order for the traveling carriage to be readied for first light the following morning. Gideon learned of it that evening, not from Eleanor, but from Hattie, who, torn between loyalty to her mistress and a growing, gnawing certainty that something had gone badly and silently wrong, finally confessed everything: the open library door, the overheard conversation, the date and the hour of it, and the carriage now ordered for dawn. Gideon went very still as the pieces arranged themselves, the date matching, with horrible precision, the conversation with his mother in the East Corridor. The words he had spoken in exhaustion and frustration, never once imagining anyone but Constance could hear them. Eleanor's quiet these past 2 days. Her careful, deliberate distance. The letter to her aunt that Hattie mentioned almost as an afterthought, the way one mentions the final piece of a puzzle without quite registering, yet, what picture it completes. He set down his glass. For the first time in longer than he could recall, Gideon Ashworth felt something very close to panic, the specific, lurching panic of a man who has just understood that the most important conversation of his marriage took place without his knowledge, was overheard in its entirety by the one person it was about, and ended with him saying the single worst thing he could possibly have said, at the single worst possible moment, through a door he had never thought to check. By the time he reached Eleanor's chambers, her trunk was already half-packed, and she stood at the window with her back to the door, her arms wrapped around herself in the particular way of someone holding herself together through sheer, deliberate effort. "Eleanor." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "We need to talk about what you heard in the library." Eleanor did not turn at once. When she finally did, her eyes were dry, but there was a distance in them Gideon had never seen before, as though some part of her had already left, even though her trunk wasn't yet closed and the carriage wouldn't come for hours. "There's nothing to talk about," she said, with a calm that frightened him considerably more than tears would have. "You were honest with your mother. I should be grateful for the clarity, even if the timing was unfortunate." "Eleanor, what I said. Was true. She finished the sentence for him, evenly. A bargain. A transaction. Never meant to be anything else. Your words, Gideon. Not mine. They were a lie. That stopped her. Gideon crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could see he hadn't slept, that whatever composure she had gathered for herself, he had none of his own left to offer. My mother has spent 3 days pressing me toward an alliance with the Brightmores, he said. She believes that if she can convince herself this marriage means nothing to me, she'll abandon the scheme, stop involving Lord Brightmore, stop turning this into a campaign she thinks she can win. I told her what she wanted to hear because I thought, genuinely thought, it would end the matter. I never imagined you would hear it. And I never imagined how much it would cost me to say it, even as a lie, until I said it. Eleanor searched his face, wanting, needing, to believe him, and afraid of being wrong about him twice in the same week. You let your mother believe our marriage meant nothing, to protect it? I let her believe I didn't care, Gideon said, because the moment she understands that I do, that you matter to me more than the estate, more than the alliance, more than anything she could offer in its place, she will use it. Against you. Against us. In ways I couldn't begin to predict, and wouldn't be able to stop. I was trying to take away the one thing she could turn into a weapon. I was a fool. I should have told you the conversation might happen at all, instead of simply telling you not to let it touch you, as though that were a thing a person could simply decide. It already had, Eleanor said quietly. Before you ever said a word to her. The moment I heard bargain, nothing that came after it mattered. Then let me say the true thing instead, Gideon said. The thing I should have told my mother, and didn't, because admitting it to her would have meant admitting it to myself first, out loud, and I wasn't ready. He took her hands, the way he had 2 days earlier, before the floor of the world had tilted sideways under both of them. You were never a bargain to me, Eleanor. Not after the first month. Possibly not after the first week. I married you to save Calloway, that part was true, once. But somewhere in these 11 months, you became the reason I wanted to save it at all. If my mother takes everything else from this family, I find I no longer particularly care, so long as it doesn't take you. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing at all. Then, slowly, she pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the unsteady rhythm beneath it, proof, if she needed any, that every word had cost him something real. The carriage is ordered for sunrise, she said at last. I'll cancel it. Don't. A small, fragile smile touched her mouth, the involuntary kind, the kind that arrived before she'd decided to allow it. Send word to my aunt that I'll be a fortnight late. I think your mother and I have a conversation of our own to finish first. Gideon's brows lifted, alarm and something close to admiration crossing his face at once. Eleanor. You fought your battle with words behind a closed door, Your Grace, she said, already turning toward the wardrobe, already reaching for tomorrow's gown. I intend to fight mine in the open, at breakfast, in front of the entire household, where your mother can hear every word I have to say about bargains, and transactions, and exactly what this particular merchant's daughter is worth. For the first time in days, Gideon laughed, low, startled, and entirely real. What Eleanor said at breakfast the next morning, calmly, over toast, in the same scrupulously polite voice she used for everything that mattered most, would become, in time, one of the most quietly retold stories in the history of Calloway Manor. Constance Ashworth left for her own estate 4 days early, citing the weather. The weather, that week, was unremarkable. Lord Brightmore's interest in an alliance was never raised at Calloway again. And the library door, from that winter onward, stayed exactly as Eleanor preferred it, very slightly ajar, though Gideon, for the rest of his life, made a habit of checking the corridor first. If you found something in Eleanor tonight, if you know what it's like to sit very still while someone says the thing you were always quietly afraid of, and to choose, the next morning, to answer it instead of disappearing into it, then this story was for you. There's a whole world of stories like this one waiting for you here. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear, today, that the door being open isn't always the worst thing that can happen. Sometimes it's how the truth finally gets a chance to be heard at all. See you in the next story.